Thank you, Madhuka. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever that you're joining from today, and welcome you all to the 47th SLEvA webinar on Looking Inward, Moving Forward, the launch of the Toolkit for Indigenous Evaluations for Asia Pacific region. Today's webinar is brought to you by uh, SLEvA and APIA with collaboration of Evaluate Sri Lanka, Center for Evaluation, University of Sri Javadanapura, Eval for Partners, Eval Indigenous, and Eval for Action campaign. Next slide, please. So I'm Hasiti Samarasinghe, co-leader of Evaluate Asia, and I will be your moderator for this session. Next slide, please. So before the webinar starts, there are a few reminders from the production team. Please keep your microphone and video disabled so that it will help to lessen the load on your internet bandwidth and preserve the quality. And if you have any questions or concerns, or if you have any comments while our presentation proceeds, you can leave them in the chat bar. If it is a production related concern, our production team will be shortly reach out to you. The next slide. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the platform to Serge Eric Yakus. Serge is the co-chair of Eval Indigenous. Serge, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ashiti. Good morning to those who are in the morning times. Good afternoon and good evening for our friends in Asia Pacific. I know it should be a little bit late, but somehow we are happy to find a suitable time, to match the expectation and availability of so many participants. Yes, indeed, I'm the co-chair of Indigenous, and together my colleagues Fiona from New Zealand. She can't make it because it's too early in New Zealand. We are so happy and so proud to get a special work done by the APIA teams and under these engineered projects. Maybe just to remind about the project itself. The initiative started 2 years ago when we tried to look about how we can make better use and also document the engineering practice worldwide. So the project itself, we know, is looking to look into index and promoting engineers' approaches in the services of equity center evaluations. And the aim is to put engineer people in the middle evaluation so that we can learn from most of the approaches. So this project, as you know, we decided to move forward with two sub-app. The first app is the APIA teams. I mean the APIA, Asia Pacific, in the Asia, let's say in the eastern part of the world, and then we have another second sub-app in Africa, and the last one in the Latin America, Central Latin America. But of course, we think that as let's say test phases or try phases, we'll be able to look at the lesson learned from these projects and then see how we can now move globally. Because as you know, evaluation is a global movement of regions evaluators and Indian practitioners. So this project also gains energy and synergy from number of partners, which includes EVA partners, which is the main umbrella of EVA engineers, and then I can talk more about APIA because APIA is the one leading now. But also, most importantly, ACDENS. ACDENS is the Africa Agenda for the Evaluation and works in Africa. The Mature, and then they use the Maori National Monthly Evaluation in New Zealand, and then the EVAL SDG. Why? Because also the work EVAL engineers want to factor and then be put in the center or be centered into the SDG achievement. So I'm happy that these communication, especially about the toolkits, we're talking about communication strategy, will gain participants more information about how can we look inwards and also look upwards. I want to add upward because we also not looking inside, we also look about around ourselves to see how we can better communicate with the people. So without due delay, I want to hand over to you and thank you all, those who are participating, and get a fruitful discussion today is an initial step, because we have a peer conference coming soon. And then we also learn from initially about what you are trying to achieve, in the Asia region so that it can inform the Africans and Latin America team on the way they can do their own. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And over to you, and then let us enjoy what you are planning to share with us today. Thank you.
Asiti, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So thank you again, Serge, about that well-contained yet elaborative explanation about what was going behind this project. So again, today with great pleasure, we are launching the Toolkit for Indigenous Evaluations in the Asia Pacific region, including the findings of the research that we did. And this toolkit represents a significant milestone in the Asia Pacific Evaluation Association's ongoing efforts to honor and empower Indigenous communities through thoughtful, culturally less responsive, and sensitive evaluation practices. So now I will introduce our speakers of the day. We have Maduka Lenagamage, co-leader of Evaluate Asia. The next. And then we have Mr. Dulmina Chamatkara, who's co-founder of Evaluate Asia and Evaluate Sri Lanka. Next slide. And we have Carlo Panyan from Philippines. He's the finance officer of Appian. And then Dorothy May Albiento, co-leader of Evaluate Asia from Philippines. So speakers, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hasiti, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this session. And by this session, we hope to give you an overall idea about an interesting project that we have been involved in the past few months. Chamatkar, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so today we are actually going to give you an overall idea about the introduce this toolkit and the methodology and key findings and key takeaways and way forward. So first, I would like to give you a brief introduction. And this project was funded by Ford Foundation to Eval Indigenous Network, which is part of Eval Partners. And for the Asia Pacific region, Asia Pacific Evaluation Association is the implementing partner. And this project is also going on in other regions such as Latin America and Africa. So the overall objective of the project is to strengthen demand for culturally responsive indigenous evaluation practices. As you can see here at the on the right left-hand side, this project actually consists of 5 different activities, and the developing toolkit is one of these activities. So today we mainly focus on this toolkit. And go to the next slide, please. Okay. So when it comes to the purpose of the toolkit, this can be served as both a practical guide as well as an advocacy tool. So we basically aim this will be very useful for the researchers, evaluators, and wise or the policymakers and public officials who are actually working with the indigenous communities in the region, as well as ones who hope to work with them in future. And not only that, we hope this will definitely helpful for the indigenous communities who are working with these researchers and evaluators. Next slide. So to develop this toolkit, we did fieldwork in 2 countries, Sri Lanka and Philippines. So as you can see here in the map, we did fieldwork in 3 locations in Sri Lanka, which are Dambana. Dambana is the indigenous capital in Sri Lanka, and Ratugala and Polladata. Also in Philippines, our team did fieldwork in northern Luzon, where the Kalahan community, that is one of the indigenous communities in Philippines, based in. Next slide, please. So for the fieldwork and for the study, we use different methodologies. So first, we gathered information from the existing studies on the indigenous and culturally responsive evaluation practices. We mainly referred some of the reports which are published by Eval Indigenous. And also then we conducted an online qualitative survey, which is Atlas survey, to gather information about the experiences of evaluators and especially indigenous evaluators who are working with the indigenous communities in the region. And then in the field, we mainly use focus group discussion to gather data, as well as conducted some KIIS, key informative interviews with indigenous leaders and community members, and as well as some stakeholders such as the public officials and some staff members of the tourist hotels in these regions, in these areas, who are directly working with indigenous communities. And also, even though we conducted fieldwork in these two countries, we were able to gather valuable information from the evaluators who are working with indigenous communities in other countries too, by doing some online video interviews. In that way, we were able to get some valuable information from evaluators in South Asia, East Asia, and also in the Pacific. Especially, we were able to get some valuable information from some indigenous evaluators too. And I think now my colleague, one of my colleagues will post the YouTube link, which we have uploaded some of these interviews we conducted with indigenous evaluators, as well as some of the evaluators who are working with the indigenous communities in other countries. So these are the key methodologies that we use for this study. And now I would like to pass the floor to my colleague Carlo to explain more about the findings and challenges that we face. Thank you so much, and over to you, Carlo.
Thank you, Maduka. So greetings to everyone. I am Carlo, and I will be talking about the key findings of our study relating specifically to the background of some indigenous communities and the challenges that they face in today's modern context. So as shown by this map, the globe is home to a rich tapestry of cultures. China alone is inhabited by a population of over 100 million indigenous people, as reported by the World Bank. For this study, however, we focused on Sri Lanka and the Philippines. So Sri Lanka is a South Asian island nation home to the indigenous people collectively known as the Vedas. They are thought to have been descended from the country's first hunter-gatherer populations. Today, they occupy forested, mountainous, and coastal regions of Sri Lanka, including Dambana, Bulugkhadena, Henebeda, and Rathkula. The Vedas have a cultural identity distinct from the Sinhalese people of Sri Lanka. Their language, Vedaham, is thought to be a language isolate separate from Sinhala. Their traditional music and dance styles show their close relationship with nature, as well as their hunting and gathering lifestyle. And woven into their cultural fabric are spiritual beliefs rooted in animism and ancestral veneration. Moving on to the Philippines, it is an archipelago in Southeast Asia and home to several indigenous communities. Specific to this study, however, is the Ikalahan community of northern Luzon. Since 1965, the people of the tribe have worked with Pastor Delbert Rice, an American missionary turned anthropologist, for the development and preservation of their indigenous cultural practices and community-based forestry. They fought hard legal battles for the ownership of their ancestral domain and won. Hence, the Kalahan Educational Foundation was born, organized by the community for the community to represent and educate their people, as well as to serve as the face of their community within the greater sphere of the Philippine political landscape. So next slide, please. Okay, so while these communities that I have previously mentioned are drastically different in terms of context and culture, we discovered that they face similar challenges in the face of political conflict, economic instability, insensitive development efforts, and unethical research and evaluation. The first of these challenges is land displacement. Because of national development projects and the growth of the tourism industry, many indigenous communities are driven out of their ancestral land. While this may be caused by disputes on land rights and tensions between modern governing bodies, there is also the problem of environmental degradation. Since many indigenous practices are tied to nature and natural resources, the communities are vulnerable to abusive and environmentally insensitive policies. The second of these is cultural erosion. Some indigenous peoples who have encountered a lack of access to basic needs and services and gainful opportunity make the difficult decision to leave their village and assimilate elsewhere. These people, especially children and young adults, may miss important indigenous experiences, and thus the transfer of narratives, values, and histories can become difficult. The third challenge is extractive research on indigenous knowledge. Our informants report that some researchers and evaluators fail to share their research findings to their subject community. Some report that this may go as far as researchers claiming indigenous knowledge to be their own. Some informants criticize culturally insensitive methodologies and question the disruption to their daily lives as compared to the benefit of such studies to the community. Hence, our informants clamor for representation leading to self-determination, where their consent, input, and participation are considered in research, evaluation, and development efforts, and that their choices and voices direct the way to their own futures. So that was a summary of our findings on challenges faced by indigenous communities. I now give the floor to the next speaker for experiences and joys of working with indigenous communities. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Carlo. Yes, greetings to all of you. So I'll be speaking about the first experiences and joys of the evaluators that we found through our study, and then the challenges which evaluators face while working with the indigenous communities, as well as the guidelines that we suggested and we got, we derived from the findings that we got. So first of all, regarding the experiences and joys of working with indigenous communities, actually, according to the findings, most of the evaluators who works with indigenous communities, they mentioned it's actually a remarkable journey for them, like understanding and the
Silang bagong tools toolkit.
partnership with them, and also respecting their knowledge, attitudes, and practices about the environment, natural sciences, and these things. So as mentioned in the points of distinctive perspectives of indigenous communities, and also where these studies provide as a catalyst for fresh perspectives. So these they have this indigenous community, they have unique perspectives on events, reality, interpretation, and decision making, and also new the indigenous evaluators, they have like gained new perspectives to community challenges all around the world through studies about the indigenous communities, and also propose alternative solutions and a catalyst for alternatives for the issues that they face, the global issues that they face currently, and also some invaluable lessons, enhance group of culture and values and way of life, and also value of indigenous heritage and also cultural contextualization. And as they express, most of the these indigenous people, they have deep connection to land, nature, and also a strong sense of community development, those things. And also they are passionate about preserving culture and tradition. And the indigenous these evaluators that findings suggest that they are like they consider the working with the indigenous committee is an opportunity to support them. And also, they have identified, as per their explanation, the need of contextualize their studies towards their like own traditions, own practices, and design evaluations or the research towards more towards their own practices. And also, mostly they, I mean, the indigenous evaluators, they mentioned it's a joy and this evaluate working with evaluations indigenous stories provided a remarkable positivity and sincerity and also openness when they approach these indigenous committees properly, and also positive working atmosphere with them, and joyful interactions, and also much like closeness towards the environment, and also finally advocating for indigenous rights. So the these evaluators, they mentioned that it is like privilege that they got, that they could make aware of other people regarding these indigenous communities all around the world, and the challenges faced by the evaluators working in the indigenous communities. So most common one is the language barriers, mostly the miscommunication by the translators, and also it is um, difficulties to get the correct idea, and then it hindered the trust and relationship between the evaluators and the indigenous committees, and also lack of awareness of evaluation. So most of the indigenous communities, they don't have that much idea what is an evaluation or what is evaluation. So mostly even in our studies when we did the field work, it was hard for us. So we had to mention some other layman terms this is a survey or research kind of thing. Make them aware of the evaluation, and they have to avoid the confusion with the indigenous community, and also accessibility issues. So mostly in some studies we learned that indigenous these evaluators face accessibility issues, and sometimes these communities are excluded from the evaluation or data collection because of this issue. And reluctance and cultural barriers. The indigenous communities, they have their own cultural practices, traditional values that they practice for like thousands of years. So some of these cultural practices reluct or them indigenous communities in evaluators in getting approaching the indigenous community. So one of the example is in Sri Lanka, where the committees usually women, they don't talk that, they are not that much open to outsiders. Mostly men, indigenous men, they talk with outsiders. So there should be some other approaches used by indigenous evaluators to approach the women and get their consent, and do the field work or get them on board. And also incentive driven participation. This is one of the biggest challenge, I believe, depending because as we got, so most of the indigenous community, they expect uh, or try, they are used to receiving incentives from many other people, and or because of that they are reluctant to engage without material goods or monetary assistance from the evaluators or any other researchers who come to, go to there and for the data collection and for the studies. And also trust and relationship building. They have already lost their faith in the researchers or the evaluators, because they haven't seen that much like results or impact on their livelihood or on their communities because of these the past studies or evaluations that they join. So they have they don't trust that much about the evaluators or the researchers because of these issues. So these are the main challenges. So we that we identified through the study that evaluators face, and based on these all of these findings, there are and also the other findings the team has derived some guidelines based on the lessons learned. So, so I'll be so these there are five key guidelines. So I'll be explaining them one by one. The first one is honor and respect cultural traditions and norms of the indigenous community. As I mentioned, they have rich and very like valuable cultural practices and traditions, cultural norms, and these are not very dynamic and unique to each culture, each indigenous community. So. Uh, Indigenous evaluators they should understand and appreciate these cultural values, and it is crucial to listen, learn, and avoid like the ideologies that they have in their minds, and go there open and take these cultural traditions and norms into account, and lay do the field work or the conduct the studies. And the next one is secure approval and consent from key stakeholders. So the mainly in the as we found the indigenous communities, the indigenous community leader, uh, he or she is the main person in the community who deal with other stakeholders or other outsiders regarding the community issues or regarding any intervention happening. So it is necessary to get the approval or consent from these indigenous leaders, and as well as the community members, and also there are many other stakeholders who work with indigenous communities. As an example, in Sri Lanka, Central Cultural Fund, they are the agency the government agency who are responsible for the indigenous community related interventions. So it is a must to take this approval consent for to do a better study without any issues or any hindrance. And then the lesson 3, the plan to involve the committee in the evaluation process. So as we identify, it is necessary to involve the committee members from the evaluation design and until the evaluation dissemination and the final dissemination. So there should be the community involved in these studies, the evaluations, and the evaluators should ensure their voices are heard, the committee members their voices are heard and integral into decision making. This build the ownership of the study to these indigenous communities, and more effective studies could be implemented through them and get more better results to involving a committee in the evaluation process, and decolonize evaluation research approaches. So as I mentioned in the last point, it is necessary to uh, take indigenous perspective and approaches in study design, recognizing their unique and other knowledge system. Sometimes they may have better options to involvement and better options to study their own culture other than what we learned or what we practice usually. So it is necessary to engage their perspectives in evaluation design and throughout the evaluation or the other studies. And the final point is engage the indigenous communities in dissemination of evaluation findings. So this is the most one of the most important points or guidelines that we gain from most of the studies, from through our studies, and also that we observed during our other indigenous studies also. So involving, so it is necessary that they identify what are the results that we gain, or what are the recommendations that we or the evaluators derived from the findings, and make sure whether these are kind of triangulate whether these are um, okay, or the necessary, or whether these are true recommendations, and whether these are applicable for these committees. So it is kind of dissemination as well as proofreading of the recommendations or the key outputs that derived from the study, and it will provide more better recommendations or better suggestions for the improvement of that community or the community members or the livelihood. So it is very important to engage indigenous communities in the dissemination process, just not derive the recommendations or just the provide do some suggestions and not doing and making them a part of the dissemination and or the implementation of the recommendation. So these are the 5 guidelines that derived from the our studies, and I now hand over the presentation to May to continue with the key takeaways and way forward.
Thanks, Chama. So today my task for this webinar will be to share some of our team's key insights from this project. So first is that we realize that Asia Pacific is an extremely diverse region and is actually home to 2/3 of the world's indigenous peoples. This toolkit was only able to capture the experiences of selected indigenous communities in 2 countries. So there's still so much to explore, learn from, and document if we really want to expand to other indigenous communities here in our region. And this speaks to the need really to expand this study, to include all the experiences of other indigenous communities and also evaluators working with indigenous communities in our region. Second, the negative experience of indigenous communities that we heard in Sri Lanka and the Philippines, and have read from the survey responses of evaluators, which my teammates have earlier mentioned, underline the need for guidance on the conduct of indigenous evaluation and research in the region. Although our research was confined to just Sri Lanka and the Philippines, we suspect that indigenous communities from other countries have also experienced the same challenges. The next one is that we also realized from listening to the experiences of indigenous community leaders and community members that the toolkit should not only target researchers and evaluators, but also the indigenous communities themselves. So they can also be guided on how to better interact with evaluators and researchers to ensure that the studies will truly benefit their community. And lastly, we really hope that principles we found to be common the communities we visited and the sharing of the evaluators who have worked with these communities will spark further discussions around the need for culturally responsive evaluations in our region. And this project really calls for more conversations around the importance of developing and using indigenous evaluation frameworks and promoting culturally responsive evaluations in Asia Pacific. We need to advocate for it more. And just to share some of the interesting recommendations that we have heard from our research, that we can do this through webinars and knowledge sharing activities, as well as setting up policies for engaging with communities, documenting good practices and engaging with indigenous communities, and lastly, capacity building for indigenous evaluators and evaluators working with indigenous communities. Next slide, Chama. Please do note that the toolkit is still currently being finalized. And aside from this webinar, we are sharing our findings at the Indigenous Evaluation Panel session at the APEA conference in December 2023. And any feedback that we collect from this webinar and from the APEA conference session will feed into the final toolkit, which we hope to publish by the end of December of this year. We also invite you to check APEA's social media pages, and YouTube in particular for the Voices videos. We curated our interviews with Indigenous leaders and evaluators and created short advocacy videos on Indigenous evaluations. We will be posting more videos of these interviews until December. And of course, part of the plan is really to share the toolkit with the Indigenous communities we worked with during the project as our way of honoring the knowledge and insights they shared with us to develop this very important research. So over to you, Hasiti.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Wow, I mean that was a really, really, really wonderful presentation, and I'm pretty sure that this toolkit is going to be a source of inspiration and guidance to those who seek to create a positive change in, partnership with our indigenous communities in Asia Pacific region. So we have a few questions in the chat box, as well as I can see people are sharing their comments. So the first question is from Daniel. Individuals from indigenous communities may not be called or call themselves evaluators, yet they do important evaluation work. So, what are the differences between indigenous evaluation and culturally responsive evaluation practices? We have our speakers, as well as we have Serge and Andriuza. If any of you can answer this question. Maybe Serge or Andrea, if you can add something.
So professionalization of evaluation as an identity is relatively recent in the last 40, 50 years, but we recognize in Canada that Indigenous peoples and all peoples have been engaging in evaluative processes as a means of learning, of management, and of sense making, and that evaluation is an everyday activity of everybody. So the efforts to professionalize and articulate ethics and standards and competencies is not intended to discount that everybody does evaluation and all peoples traditionally did evaluation. And then in addition, decolonizing our concept and our infrastructure around professional evaluation is a process of being explicitly inclusive of Indigenous knowledge processes and rights.
Yeah, thanks, Andrisa. I think we want to maybe to hear more from our listeners, where you were just came back freshly from the field. So how can you just mark up this question from Daniel based on your living time on the field with all those three communities on the three different regions? So that might be the best for us to learn, and so that we can share maybe our broad perspective, our broad experience. Maybe I don't know if just Lami and we against our speakers, we have they can share their thought and then we can complement later.
Any inputs from our speakers? Or since we have only like 10 minutes, maybe can we move to the next question, maybe? And then
yeah, go to the next question, please.
Okay, so we have a question to Chamatkar. Based on your explanation, I thought to ask, do we need to add one more challenge faced? Low or no value of evaluations perceived by indigenous community in Sri Lanka. So Jinendra is asking whether there are low or no value of evaluation perceived by indigenous community in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, one thing, yes, these are just very a few challenges that we explained that they are facing. There are many other challenges that evaluators face. And so regarding the point that Jinendra mentions, low or
Ah. Chamatkar, your connection
of
is
evaluation as per our findings and per personal experience through several studies on with different indigenous communities in Sri Lanka. So they don't have that much idea about the word evaluation, but they have some evaluation practices, but not systematic. Like let's say they have this what we call they are the annual gathering. Maybe Hasiti remembers the name that we call it Variga Sabha. But it's not kind of evaluation or gathering, but they discuss their all the questions, and all the community members join from all around the country, from all the villages to Dambana. On more usually it's on August 6th of August. The indigenous usually it happens on 6th of August. Then they discuss, but the main point is that there's no women involved in any kind of this discussion. Only men involved in the discussion. So sometimes it's not the proper evaluation, but they do discuss their problems and issues they have. Then they evaluate what are the things that they need to do, and sometimes they suggest take these suggestions to the government and public officials, the thing. So but there we haven't see any systematic evaluations happening with them, and also the proper follow up or to the suggestions that they made.
Thank you.
Maybe
Thank you, Chamatkar. Yeah. So the next question will be how to ensure meaningful participation of the indigenous people in evaluation. That's a really good question. So one of our speakers, or we have other members from our research group today, Ramdika, any of you, if you can answer this question.
Yeah, okay, Hasiti. Let me answer this question from Jank. So how to ensure meaningful participation of indigenous people? So I think in our toolkit, one of the lessons is that lesson 3, plan to involve the community, the indigenous community in the evaluation process. So we are talking here based on our studies, not just involving them as respondents, just going and interviewing them, but to make them fully involved in the evaluation process from the design stage through to the dissemination, where they take actively part in the research study, or the evaluation study. So for our study, we actually had indigenous community members part of our evaluation study. So for example, in the Philippines, in Nikalan community, we have 2 research assistants assisting us for this evaluation study. So that way we build their evaluation capacity. So one of the lessons also we have in this toolkit is to try to involve indigenous people part of the study. Even in Sri Lanka, we had some of them involved assisting us in the study. So that way they also increase their awareness about evaluation. And as we had mentioned in Chamatkar, in one of the lessons that we have developed in the toolkit, is this has to be participatory, and involving the community and getting their buy-in for the study is important through making sure they are engaged right throughout the process and not just as interviews. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Randika, for that valuable input. And then Bhubanji is from Nepal, I think, sharing. some weaves. There could be some more process through which land displacement takes place. The raising land prices, particularly in the bigger market centers, encourage indigenous people to sell their land. And another is land requirements for the administrative centers, displacing indigenous people. Yes, I think this is something that we observe throughout our research. And then we have another question from Daniel. What is the difference between lesson 3, which is affording indigenous communities a stake and voice in the evaluation process, and the lesson 4, decolonizing the evaluation approach and method? Maybe May or any other speaker can answer this question.
I'll answer. Maybe others can also add. So the lesson 3 is regarding making, these indigenous community members as the part of the group, like make like this, like providing an ownership, making, as Randika mentioned as the answer for the previous question, making like taking them as a part, and also making them part of from the beginning, like the design, evaluation design to the dissemination process. And the fourth point is regarding getting their perspectives, perspectives, as well as making our the study or the study design more towards their cultural and their practices, not to the traditional or conventional practices that evaluators use. So basically, it's the first one is the third one is getting them involved. The fourth one is like adapting our evaluation, or adapting the evaluation methodology, and adapting the evaluation practices to their own practices, not the conventional practices that we use. Maybe others also can add.
So let me add also. So for lesson 4, which was decolonizing evaluation, research approaches, and methodologies. So basically, indigenous communities have their own knowledge system, and the way they measure progress and make decisions, and their definition of evaluation is different than the Western frameworks. So that's why, as evaluators, we need to integrate their perspective and approaches like Chamatkara mentioned when we are doing their studies. So this is one of the lessons that we have outlined, and there are some examples in our toolkit. So when it's ready, you all will be able to see more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Randika. Sir, I can see your hand is raised. Please.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. When I listen to Randika about engineers' perspective, and then I can also add maybe engineers a protocol. You know how when you go to the communities, it's not like everywhere you are going you can easily get access. But I want to ask to our researchers, do you face any challenges in getting into those communities, or to getting the people into the interview? So were there any kind of protocol to follow, any kind of barriers, any kind of cultural setting to adapt with? So how does it work? Let us know how does it work when you went to the field. That could be very informative, very important to know, because sometimes it's very, very specific to how people believe it's followed and respected by those coming, let's say foreigner, those coming outside from the community. Were there any kind of challenges similar like this, or any protocol to follow? If yes, please share with us, please.
Speakers. Yes, we have a good question. So I think the Sri Lankan team might have some inputs. Madhuka, Chamatkara, Randika.
So let me start with the Sri Lankan study, but then Carlo and even the team members can add on Philippines, because there's a moratorium against indigenous communities doing research. So Carlo, y'all can explain how y'all went about that. But in Sri Lanka also, you can see from our Voices project, the indigenous leader has also mentioned that they haven't seen tangible results from evaluation or research studies, so they are skeptical about evaluators and researchers. So one thing is you need to get their buy-in. And one thing we have learned is that from these studies is that they require evaluators or researchers wanting to do these studies to come to them personally and meet them in their houses. They feel that nowadays sometimes people don't do that, and it's very disrespectful, they feel. And they feel like their name is used just to make money sometimes. So it's actually that example is outlined in our guidebook from Sri Lanka, that this is the way to go about to get that. You have to build that relationship and trust, because you can see that in the video and the Voices project from the indigenous leaders in Sri Lanka. They are really skeptical about researchers and evaluators because they have seen that sometimes they're taken advantage. So that's why we have this toolkit is useful, providing guidelines on how to be more culturally responsive and aware and sensitive to their needs. So that's for Sri Lanka. Carlo, can you add for Philippines?
Okay, sure, Randika. When it comes to our field work in the Philippines, one of the challenges that we encountered, or at least heard of, was because there was this moratorium for researchers and evaluations in the community, that the community didn't want to entertain researchers and evaluators. And we kind of just requested and kind of asked them if we could do a short study, and because we tried to build rapport with them and they allowed us to do so. But the way that they explain this session is sometimes they feel over-researched, because this community specifically has been the subject of many researches and evaluations, because they were able to organize themselves as an indigenous community to participate in legal battles, in policy considerations with the larger government of the Philippines. Because some researchers and evaluators would go there, and the way that they think about it is that people who visit them to research and evaluate, their friends, and they expect that they would also build rapport with the community, treat them as friends too. And sometimes evaluators and researchers, they don't do that, and they feel offended with the hospitality that they've shown. With this, they've started thinking about and criticizing some methodologies with the researchers that they've experienced, and they've began talking amongst themselves about their perspectives on those kinds of visitations. So that was our experience in the Philippine field.
Thank you. Any other inputs from Andre Lisa or such any comments, additions?
I would just add that in our context, because Canada in 2021 passed an act for the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we also have a lot of treaties and so on, so that Indigenous peoples are distinct and have the right to self-governance. And so that means that decolonizing evaluation means investing in inquiry processes that are initiated by Indigenous peoples as part of their own governance and advocacy and learning and processes, and that the non-Indigenous funders do not expect or should not have the right to the knowledge that is produced, because it's for and by the community and as the community, just as the federal government has its own knowledge functions. So do Indigenous governments need to have their own decolonized knowledge functions. The second consideration with decolonizing evaluation is that to have true consent, it's not only a participatory collaborative approach with design and methods, but the determination that an inquiry will happen. So, and not tied to access to funding as a condition of funding. And so that's part of decolonizing the understanding that Indigenous peoples have rights, and that it's rights-based funding. And so that the funder also needs to be accountable to Indigenous peoples for whether it's a grantee or like a philanthropic grant or international development, or whether it's within a nation, that the funder needs to be accountable to the way that the funding and the processes are upholding Indigenous rights to self-determination.
You're muted, Hasiti.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much, Andrea, Lisa, and all our speakers and Serge and our research team. Thank you for your input. Since we're running behind of time, I'll quickly move on to the closing remarks. So for closing remarks, I would like to invite in Andrea Belsa. She's the president of Canadian Evaluation Society. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So in closing, I guess what I'd like to say is that in addition to the importance of distinctions among Indigenous peoples, there are a lot of commonalities, and that's why the network of Val Indigenous and the sharing of these products and this toolkit globally is really valuable. Because the displacement of Indigenous peoples who had a spiritual and a relationship with place, in which, as was mentioned, the economics, the livelihood, the culture, the spirituality, the food systems, everything was interdependent, and is in many cases, to the extent that people are still hunting and foraging and so on. And so the idea of a nature positive way of living in a place is something that the whole world needs to remember, and as we transform our systems. And so it's so important to view Indigenous evaluation as having multiple reasons why it's so important and precious to invest in. So as I mentioned, there's the Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty and regeneration, nation rebuilding and revitalization of culture and place. There's also the right of Indigenous people to influence the stewardship of their traditional territories. And where people were nomadic, or there were multiple peoples who were active in a place, then it's not necessarily just a matter of a people who determines over the stewardship of air, water, biodiversity, and so on in a place. There could be multiple Indigenous peoples who need to be listened to and respected in their traditional ecological knowledge. And so as evaluators, decolonizing our own sense of the worldview, for example, the animist worldview or the nature-centric worldview, as an alternative way of valuing and constructing questions for all of our work in any context, that's a really precious opportunity for non-Indigenous evaluators or people who are Indigenous to a different place than where they're working. So I just wanted to appreciate the lessons that were brought forward and the value of this work to our work in Canada, and I look forward to continuing to communicate with some folks who've been involved and bringing this to our Canadian community as well.
Thank you, Andrea. I think collaboration is the key. So yes, so thanks again to our speakers and production team, and of course our participants for joining with us today and making today's event a success. And thank you everyone who has contributed to the development of this invaluable resource. Your contribution is a testament to the power of collaboration and the collective commitment for advancing Indigenous rights and well-being. So if you have any further questions or comments, please write to us. You can write to any of the email addresses shown in the presentation. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and see you hopefully in the next event, APIA, the SLEvA.
Thank you, Asiti. Well done.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you. Bye bye.